Welcome to Roots Tech Connect. My name is David Wiemat, and I'll be presenting on genealogical treasures in Irish archives. Irish archives are truly treasure troves of national, local, and family history, and I want to share with you the amazing records that are available in these archives. The Irish people love their history and heritage, and they have many archives that have historical records of value for national history as well as family history. Major government organizations like the National Archives of Ireland and the National Library, as well as academic libraries, smaller archives, genealogical and heritage centers in each county and in some of the major cities, smaller libraries, thousands of parish churches with records of genealogical value, and let's not forget the 2.5 million households across Ireland with their family stories, their family documents, and even their DNA. Now, you're not alone in this work. Many people have come before us, and some have written guidebooks on how to use the libraries and archives and what their holdings are, as well as how to actually trace your Irish ancestors with the records. So I've listed in the syllabus with this presentation some of these guidebooks to get you started. Now, is Irish family history a glass half empty or a glass half full? We've heard of many records that have been destroyed over the years, but I'm here to persuade you that it's a glass that it's at least half full. If you go online, you will find tens of millions of indexed records and millions of images behind those records that tell the stories of our Irish ancestors. Family Search alone has published 68 million indexed records of Irish censuses, birth, baptism, burial records, etc. And lots of work is going on in the archives and libraries to continue digitizing the records, and then subsequently to see that indexes are created. So a lot of preservation work is going on at the National Archives, at the National Library, potentially at the Registry of Deeds, at the General Register Office, and so forth. So let's go through some of these treasures that are housed in Irish archives. And we'll start with census returns. The National Censuses of Ireland. The first census was created in 1813. It actually took a few years. They never finished it. It was just statistical. It didn't name anybody. But then they started learning how to do censuses that named everyone in the household in 1821. In 1831, they reverted to heads of household censuses, but then in 1841 and onward, everyone was named in the census records with tremendous details. Unfortunately, many of these original records were destroyed, some of them by government order. So what we have remaining today are fragments of the 1821 through 1851 censuses, and then the entire 1901 and 1911 censuses of Ireland. We're looking forward with anticipation to the Ireland 1926 census becoming available, even though it's been reported that the 1926 Northern Ireland census was destroyed. Here's a fragment from the 1821 census from the Aran Islands, and you can see everybody in the family named with their relationships, ages, occupations, and there are additional details. In the 1911 census, you see even richer genealogical information with everyone named in the household, their relationships, their religious profession, education, their age, gender, their rank or occupation, their marital status, where they were born, which county, and languages that they speak, and other details. Beyond the national censuses, there were also censuses kept by the churches at times, like this fragment of a 1749 Church of Ireland census from the Diocese of Elphin, naming every head of household and providing some details on family composition. The 1766 Church of Ireland census, while it was destroyed, the originals were, copies had been made of portions, such as this typescript, that also annotates which households were Catholic as opposed to of the Church of Ireland. So, church and cemetery records, let's explore those next. Here's the religious affiliation in Ireland in the mid-1800s. We see that in most provinces, the majority of the population was Catholic, with 95% and 94% Catholicism in Connaught and Munster, whereas only 51% of the population was Catholic in Ulster and 86% in Leinster. Let's look at Church of Ireland records briefly. Here's the baptismal register entry of Oscar Wilde, and you see here details on his birth and baptism, his address and his parents' names, his father's occupation, great details in the baptismal records. Here's a burial register, and it names my ancestor, Mary Brown, wife of Ambrose Brown. They lived in Ventry, and it shows when she died and how old she was at the time of death. Church of Ireland parish registers are amazing. In the 1870s, when the Anglican Church was disestablished as the official government church, the earlier registers were declared public records. Many clergy sent their registers to Dublin for safekeeping, but in 1922, with the bombing of 4 courts, about half of all of the Anglican parish registers were destroyed. Those that survive began generally in the late 1700s or early 1800s, and about 1,000 parishes have now deposited their records for safekeeping at the representative church body library's archive. Microfilms of some 350 registers, the older records, are to be found at the National Archives of Ireland, and Prony has copies of the registers for the Ulster counties. The Catholic records may be in English or Latin or some mixture of the two. This Catholic baptismal register from 1831 shows the names of the people in their regular English spelling and uses Latin words for some of the headings of the columns. This Catholic marriage register is in an abbreviated form of Latin, and even the names have been Latinized. Catholic burial registers were fairly uncommon in the 1800s. Sometimes they were, if they did exist, they were simply fee books for the burials, as we're seeing in this record from Galway. So where can you find the Irish Catholic records? The original registers remain in local custody in the parishes. Some have been deposited for safekeeping at the diocesan archives. The National Library microfilmed most of these records up through 1880, a number of years ago, and has digitized and placed the images online on their website. Ancestry and Find My Past have indexed the records, and Family Search is now creating a new index. So the Catholic records are very available online. Along with the church records themselves, you'll also want to avail yourself of gravestone inscriptions. If you have the good fortune to walk through the cemetery to find your ancestors' tombstones, or if you simply find an index to the tombstone inscriptions online, these records can be valuable for your family history. Let's look at civil registration. We have birth records such as this birth certificate of my grandfather in 1893, rich in family history details. These registers have been indexed and imaged and published on the irishgenealogy.ie website, with the births going through 1919, marriages up to 1944, and deaths to 1969. You can search their website by your ancestor's name and place and date, and then click through to look at the images of the records. Let's compare the number of Catholic baptisms recorded and civil registration of births recorded decade by decade. You can see that the Catholic records began in the late 1600s, but really took off in the early 1800s, peaking in the 1830s and 40s, and then tapering off with the Great Famine, so many people dying and so many people emigrating. Then the civil registration of births began in 1864 and peaked in the 1870s, but with so many people leaving Ireland, and then with Irish independence having break away from Northern Ireland, we see a decrease in civil registers. You'll need to look at both types of records as you're searching for your Irish ancestors and their births. Court and criminal records, very underused resources, becoming more and more available. with digitization and indexing. I'll give you a couple examples. Here's a register of transportation of convicts that shows when they were convicted and of what crimes, and then they're being sent off with the ship's name and the date of departure going to Australia. You will find transportation of convict records in Irish archives. You also may find similar records in Australia. There are also a number of crimes that were reported as outrages, and these manuscript records are available at the National Archives of Ireland. Here's an example of one. The Catholic people in the parishes of the Dingle Peninsula were reporting an outrage. There was an offensive placard that was posted in front of the Roman Catholic parish by some overly zealous Anglicans that were basically making inflammatory statements about the Catholic faith. And the Catholics were asking the government for redress and for the removal of this placard. These kinds of outrages or offenses might have been for drunkenness or rape or other crimes, and you'll find lots of people named in these records and witnesses as well. And so the outrages are important to be digitized and to be indexed. They're available at the National Archives. The Petty Session Court records are a rich and abundant source of information on our ancestors. If your ancestor was either the complainant or the defendant, details will show up about him in these records. The last entry on this page is of my grandfather, William O'Connor. His crime was that on the 23rd of November 1907, he did unlawfully cast or throw fireworks on the street of the town of Tralee. Now you may think this is a child playing with fireworks, that's all that was really happening. But actually, my grandfather was 19 years old, and this date was the 40th anniversary of the hanging of the Manchester martyrs, 3 men who were hanged because they were seeking after Irish independence. My grandfather was, with many other people, taking advantage of this anniversary to push in their own way for independence from the government. And he was in the jail for 7 days for the committing of this offense. Electoral and voter registers, another underutilized record. Think of these records as census substitutes, lists of heads of household generally, and their abode and where their freeholding was. These can serve as useful records, especially before the church parish registers. Land and property valuation. Let's take a look at some of these records. The Registry of Deeds holds memorials of deeds and land conveyances and wills, as well as their transcripts. The transcripts were microfilmed by Family Search years ago. These records begin as early as 1708, and these 2 million documents are invaluable for tracing your ancestors who were involved with land transactions or perhaps with wills. The Townland valuation books. You may find perambulation books, house books, field books, all sorts of manuscript records that were documenting the land occupancy across Ireland. Not only who was occupying the land and its quality and the nature of their tenure on the property, but also when there was any change, the old information would be stricken out of the record and the new information would be written above it. And so we have a perpetual listing of every piece of property in Ireland from the mid-1800s to the present in these manuscript records. Here's an example of a house book during the famine years, 1847, 1848, revised in 1851. And if you look carefully at any property, you see great details emerge. Here's William Quilter, and if you look at what's written on the record, it basically says he occupied a dwelling house rated with a quality designation of 3C+. So that means it was an old, poor quality, thatch-roofed cottage in good repair. His house was 56 by 17 feet and stood 6 feet high. He also had a cow house, an old thatch-roofed structure half the size of his residence. This is the kind of detail you can find in the Townland valuation house books. When you couple these records together, looking at the manuscript house book, perambulation book, field book, compared with the final publication in Griffith's valuation, you see much more detail in the earlier manuscript records that doesn't make its way to the final publication in Griffith's. Why is that? In this case, the earlier manuscripts were written and revised during the potato famine, and people died, people left, people emigrated. And so what we see in Griffith's is much less than in the original manuscripts. Along with the enumeration of each property, you also have maps drawn up that can help you identify exactly where the houses were. And in my case, this led me to the house, actually a gatehouse on a property where my grandfather was born. And it was through land valuation records I was able to isolate this particular structure. These records, the later records after Griffith's valuation, continued to revise all the land holdings year by year. And so these revision books and all the changes year by year and decade by decade, these records are available at the valuation office, which is digitizing the records at this moment. The valuation office also has many series of maps that correspond to the revision books. Landed estate records. We have rent rolls, occasionally maps that list details of genealogical value from the estates of Ireland. Here's another estate rental that shows the townland, each of the tenants' names, and the nature of their land holdings. Military records. The National Archives in the United Kingdom houses amazing collections of military records county by county across Ireland. Here's an 1828 pay return from the Tralee Infantry. It doesn't name all of the men in the county, but it names those who were actually part of the military, part of the infantry back in 1828. These records begin in the late 1700s and go to the late 1800s. Here's a 1795 muster roll, similar kind of a record that lists the men that were serving in the local militia. Now, pre-1800 census substitutes, we should look at an example of this as well. So what constitutes an Irish census substitute? I would say it's any piece of paper that names an Irish ancestor. Typically, it's a list of people. So some early Irish census substitutes, back in the 1600s, there were landlords of Cavan, Donegal, and Fermanagh listed. Muster rolls from Ulster back in 1630, and so on. These records are well understood, they're characterized county by county, and the guidebooks will help you identify these kinds of census substitutes for the parishes that your ancestors lived in. Throughout the 1700s and even the early 1800s, the government suppressed the Catholic population of Ireland through a series of penal laws. Consequently, a number of Catholics converted, at least in name, to the government church, and those who converted are listed on the Catholic qualification and convert rolls. You may find your ancestors listed here. Another early census substitute is the 1796 flaxseed premiums. This is a list of people who were rewarded by the government for sowing flaxseed. This was in promotion of the linen trade. You'll see the heads of household showing up in these lists, and you can think of this as a census of heads of household in 1796. Let's look at some records that document relief given to the poor. The Board of Guardians minute books show the operations of workhouses around Ireland, and sometimes lay out details on specific aid given to individuals. Here we have a list of applicants for clothes with their names, ages, where they're from, and whether or not they were given the clothes or not. Here's a register of admissions and discharges to a workhouse. Let's look at the first entry We have George and Jane Brown and their children James and Eliza. Each of their ages is given. George was a chairmaker. And we see in the register that the family was admitted in late October 1847. This is at the beginning of the potato famine. The family was discharged from the workhouse 6 weeks later in early December, except for their daughter Eliza, who died while they were living in the workhouse under the rather austere conditions found there. During the mid-1800s, the government sought to give aid to the Irish people through the Irish Reproductive Loan Fund. And these records show how destitute the people were. We see here a summary of all of the borrowers and their securities being so destitute and fallen victims to the famine and pestilence, living in the poorhouse, having left the country, living in the most destitute of circumstances. And when we look through the actual lists of borrowers and their securities, we learn where they lived and their circumstances. You see in the last column of this list that each man is listed as dead, dead, emigrated, dead, deceased, and so on. Almost everybody listed here passed away during the famine years. Ancestry has some of these records online under the title Ireland Sustainability Loan Fund, and we can read the stories of each individual through these records. This is a town my ancestors lived in, and we read, he resided there then, was a poor laboring man, died in 1847. School registers. I'd like to show you one example from a school register. Here we have a national school register from 1913 with the name of each student with age and birth date supplied, their religion, where they lived, their father's occupation, laborer, traveling show, gardener, telegraphist, as well as the school that they had previously attended, so you can trace them from place to place. Finally, wills and administrations. Many of the probate records of Ireland were destroyed in 1922 in the bombing of 4 courts. Some survive, and the will calendars, brief abstracts of each will, those survive as well. Many of these have been indexed. I hope you've seen that the glass is more than half full. It actually is overflowing for Ireland. Irish archives are amazing in the resources that they provide, treasure troves of national, local, and family history. I wish you all the best in researching your Irish ancestors. May you find many wonderful records that tell their stories. Thank you.